Here's an album that's been reissued to death by Mobile Fidelity and I think Legacy Master Sound. Al Kooper's Super Session. I don't know, well, I know why his name's Middle, because of Alphabet. But Mike Bloomfield plays on one side from the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, and they were just jamming, and then when day 2 came around, he left a note, hey, I've gone back to San Francisco from New York. I think he had the heroin problems, as we know. And so Al Kooper quickly called Stephen Stills, who was then had left Buffalo Springfield, didn't know what to do. He was about to be in Crosby, Stills, and Nash and Young. So he's on side 2, which is more countrified, and that side's a little more electric bluesy. Mike Bloomfield, by the way, when he died in 1980, they just found his body outside of a party in San Francisco, sitting inside a 65 Chevy Impala. So that's pretty rock and roll, I have to say. So I wonder if they'd say there's Kooper, which is weird. I'm sorry, there's Bloomfield. There's Stills singing, which I don't think he sings much on this album. And there's Kooper looking a little like Frank Zappa, like an emaciated Frank Zappa, drawn by Mad Magazine. I'm wondering why they didn't put Harvey Brooks here, which I'll get to in a second. So, but it does make a nice design, which is ruined, by the way, when it's reissued and they put a big band across the top saying original master recording or whatever from Mobile Fidelity. The reason I'm doing this album, because it's pretty well known, it went to number 12 on its original release. This pressing, well, I don't know if, yeah, you can see, it's nothing special. It's a, let me see if I can wheedle this out here. Never do this. There you go. So that's the standard Columbia label from the late 60s until God knows when. Original pressings had the red label with white print that said 360 sound. That's an original pressing. This is a much later pressing, and I'm not going to try and look at the matrix, but it still sounds pretty good. This was a well-recorded album, very simple. There were some horn overdubs, and that's it. In fact, it was so inexpensive. If you read Al Kooper's book, Columbia was immediately like, we want more of this, and I always read that this led to a rash of super session albums and super groups that were paled in comparison when I don't know of that many. I don't know of tons. This is essentially a jazz album. Jazz cats would get together, they'd jam for a day or two, and then the album would be slapped together from that. Kind of Blue, the most famous jazz album probably, that's essentially what it is. It's 2 or 3 sessions with essentially the same core, maybe one guy swapping out for another. Who was it? Somebody who wasn't there, or Thelonious Monk was on some and not another. I can't remember. You can look it up. But that's essentially what this is. When I got this album originally, I was in 7th grade. That's not when this came out in 68, late 68. I was not born then. I got a used copy years and years, decades later, when I was in 7th grade, from a lady who worked at Audio Technica. They make microphones, they make mixers, they make phono cartridges. In fact, I might have, no, I don't have one of those right now. And she was selling her old records, and this was one of them. And it was great, and I enjoyed it. And I remember, I knew who some of these people were. I knew Al Kooper's name from the first Blood, Sweat, and Tears album. That's what he created. And I knew Mike Bloomfield from Paul Butterfield Blues Band, because a friend of mine, his dad had a reel-to-reel tape, the original from the store-bought, store-made from Elektra, reel tape of their first album, the Butterfield Blues Band, in their basement. Didn't have a reel deck, didn't have any other reel-to-reel tape, had a few records, and so I remember knowing about them from that. And of course I knew Stephen Stills. Crosby, Stills, and Nash I knew very well by this point. I didn't know Harvey Brooks, Barry Goldberg, or Eddie Ho too much. But Harvey Brooks, he's like the unsung hero of this album. His bass lines are amazing. He's played a lot on Columbia sessions and whatnot. That's him. Huh? That guy's rock and roll. Look how happy Mike Bloomfield looks. I don't know who this is. Oh, there he is again. Yeah. This looks like one of the Byrds, but it's not. So that must be, I think that's Barry Goldberg. So Harvey Brooks actually contributes the very last song, Harvey's Tune, which is one of my favorites in this album. The whole album's pretty good. And when they reissued it on a gold CD for Master Sound, I'm pretty sure the horn overdubs, which are most prominent on these first 2 cuts, they removed them. I don't know. But horn arrangements by Al Kooper and Joey Scott. So I always enjoyed this album, and the liner notes are interesting to read. I'm not sure who Michael Thomas is. I probably should know. And I remember when I read it in 7th grade, I thought, can they put that? But they had. And so this copy, though, is not the copy I got from that lady. I gave that away at some point or sold it. It was pretty beat up. This one's in pretty nice shape. I got it for $3 at a store that is in Lakewood, Ohio, right next to the Capitol Theater called Hausfrau Records, which usually when you walk in, they're playing something like, postmodern, nerdcore, folk, something very bizarre. But the people who work there are always pretty nice. They're not the typical sneering at me record store owners who think, ugh, that's cool, you're buying an old album from before 1998. And they have a nice dollar bin now, although I have everything in there. But they always seem to have things like this laying around for $3, $4, $5. I've gotten Van Morrison albums. One of Johnny Cash's American recordings from the 90s I got for 17 or $12, and it turned out to be worth a lot more than that. And it's, of course, a good album, and it was sealed. So that's where I got this one. In between, I was almost about to get my hands on a pretty nice copy. The cover was a little beat up, with the 360 sound label that I mentioned earlier. The reason I didn't get that was this. There was a store called Spin More Records in Kent, Ohio. I think they opened in 1980. And at one time, they took up 3 storefronts. If you ever go there today, it's right next to the Kent Stage, which back then was a movie theater. The Kent Stage was their landlord, or is, or whatever. And there's a Jimmy John's where this store, where Spin More was, until about 2012. And they took up 2 storefronts for most of the time. Occasionally, they took up the 3rd storefront next door. It was crammed with 45s, which, if you listen to or read my post about the Magical Mystery Tour EP set, I'll tell you the story in there about the 45s. Well, this store was just crammed with everything. It was the typical great old record store, except the owner could not have been a bigger crabapple. It was him, his wife, and occasionally his son, who was in his 20s or 30s, running the place. And I have so many stories about that place. It turns out now, years later, as I talk to people, everyone has a story about going in there and stealing something. Well, except for the Magical Mystery Tour post, was not into that. But one day I came in, I would have been about 16, 17, and I remember I came in and I was going to ask them if they had Beatles Anthology on vinyl, number 1 or number 2, I don't know which volume yet. And off to the side I saw a box of records just sitting there, and I thought, oh, interesting. So I think I said, what's the story on these? And the owner said, oh, those aren't for sale. And then he went in the back and was doing something, there's people in. It was, no, I wasn't the only one in there. So he came out, I was just peeking through them thinking, oh, this is interesting. He said, hey, I think I told you those are not for sale. Now, I could have, mind you, I was a teenager, so I didn't know to say, oh, is it okay if I still look through them? But he wasn't out there for me to say that. But his level of angriness, I don't know, maybe there was, 7 sealed copies of the Beatles Butcher album in there, and he was trying to protect them. But I found this and that, and I was going to ask him if I could buy it, and I didn't. And I probably was sitting there until the place closed, like most of their stock. And I eventually got this much nicer copy for $3.